Hello, lovelies, and welcome back to this ongoing series regarding Stephen King's Dark Tower books. Now, this is going to be book 4, Wizard and Glass. I know that I said last time that it was going to be The Wind Through the Keyhole, which is a sort of insertion that Stephen King wrote after the series was finished, but actually The Wind Through the Keyhole doesn't really fit here. The Wind Through the Keyhole technically occurs between Wizard and Glass and Wolves of the Calla. So The Wind Through the Keyhole will actually be next. Wizard and Glass is one of the more significant of the books because it's one of the turning points. This one, first of all, it tends to divide the crowd. A lot of people regard this as one of the lesser Dark Tower books. They don't really like it. Other people regard it as the point at which the Dark Tower books really start to develop something really significant, which is it's really the background of Roland. That's what it's all about. The story, the other characters are absolutely fascinating. All of the characters that occur in these series are actually really well done and very, very interesting in and of themselves. But it's the story of Roland Deschain. That's what this whole series is. It focuses exclusively on Roland as kind of the archetypal traveler, the mythic wanderer, the character who strides worlds on an epic quest to not necessarily to circumnavigate apocalypse, because that's not what he's doing at the beginning. He doesn't really know what he's doing at the beginning. He just knows that he's got to reach the tower, and that's it. He doesn't necessarily have the agenda of stopping the multiversal collapse that's happening. He doesn't even know if he can. It's just this bizarre agenda that he has, this mythological urge that he has, that he knows defines his entire existence, that he calls his car or his fate. Wizard and Glass is where that becomes overt. It picks up, in the same way that The Wastelands doesn't have an ending, this doesn't really have a beginning. It picks up directly after The Wastelands, so you cannot pick this one up first. If you pick up Wizard and Glass first, you will be very confused. It's possible to do, and I imagine it would be very interesting to read because you will be putting together bits of narrative and mythology from things the characters say and from references back to things that you haven't read, and that would be rather interesting. But whereas most of the books before this you could read on their own and they would actually work, this one you can't. It's almost like a transitional book, and that's another thing that people have kind of an issue with. What happens is you have the beginning where they are on the train, Blaine, and Blaine is as we discussed in the last video, Blaine is absolutely off his rails, as it were, if you'll excuse the metaphor. He is mad, and they have to survive this lunatic engine, which they do in a very classically mythological way. It's a demonstration of the way King understands things like the rules of fairy tales. It's an odd little set piece that is almost its own thing. However, when that section is over, you get what is really the first absolutely overt reference to one of King's other books, because the last way station where Blaine stops and lets them off is in Topeka, Kansas. As in our world. It's in our world. It's very, very strange. But it's a version of Topeka, Kansas that we know. It's the Topeka, Kansas from The Stand, after Captain Trips has done its work and has desolated the entire world. It's empty. The plague has done its business and kind of burnt out, and they are passing through this version of Topeka, Kansas. And most of the story is really strange because it's not set in that setting. They come across a thing that Roland calls a thinny, which is basically like a portal. It's like a rip in reality that's very, very dangerous and can potentially rip apart the world that it occurs in and devour everything near it. It's a very disturbing thing. And they end up sort of camping down near this thinny. And most of the story is actually Roland telling a story about his own past. It's very, very peculiar. And this is another thing that people either like or they don't, because the narrative stops dead at this point, and for the vast, vast, vast majority of the book, it stops stone dead. Whereas most of the series thus far has been carrying the reader forward, has been carrying you through all these various worlds and states and planes of existence that Roland and his band have been walking. This one stops dead, and then it's Roland telling you the reader and his quartet, the story of his own past. And it's a story of when he was a very young man, when he was 14, and how he discovered who he is, and how he became the extremely cynical human being that he is. It's in and of itself, the story is very interesting. It's almost classically mythological in a way. It's sort of like it's the coming of age story, the literally coming of age story, in the sense that it involves Roland falling in love for the first time. It involves Roland losing love for the first time. It involves Roland learning who he is, basically. And even as a 14-year-old, the guy is implacable. You actually can't get one over on Roland. It's almost impossible. But he does make mistakes. He's still young at that point, and he doesn't take everything into consideration. And it's a very tragic story. You get to understand why he's so bitten and why he's so cynical, why he is the way he is, and why he ultimately starts out on the path that he does. This is where it happens, essentially. And the fact that he's telling his quartet these things, which are incredibly personal and reveal a lot about who he is on the inside. These are stories he probably hasn't even told to himself for years, maybe even centuries, depending on how long he's been wandering around. He certainly hasn't told anyone else for many, 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 many years. It's the story of Roland's first quartet, the band of brothers that he had, whom ultimately, we've had suggestions all the way through that the original quartet are all dead. And Roland, there's been a suggestion that Roland was the one who killed them, that he was forced to take them out one way or another. And that's true, that's actually true. He did end up ultimately sacrificing them all on his way to the tower. And him telling his current quartet this is kind of like it's a sealing of the honor between them. It's a sealing of their place, but also a kind of warning. He's basically telling them, this could be you and very well will be you. The setting that it paints is really interesting. It's a place in sort of just outside of Gilead, where Roland grew up, the kingdom of Gilead. It's like a barony of Gilead. It's this tiny little town that's part sort of D&D fantasy village that has witches and wise women and whatnot, but also Sergio Leone cowboy town. It kind of crystallizes the mythological and narrative influences that this series has, the principal ones anyway, and provides you a setting that's born of both. You also get to see a situation that's a little bit more populous and hale and hearty than anything we've seen thus far, because this is before the world started to move on. This is just on the edge, when war is coming, when the degradations that have claimed most of civilization in all of reality are just beginning to hit. So whilst things aren't necessarily good in this town, they aren't necessarily apocalyptic either. This society is functioning. It's corrupt, it's diseased, it has issues, but it is functioning. And you get to see a whole host of new characters who are very well drawn. You get to see some very interesting additions to the main mythology that kind of they sort of explore it a little bit deeper. There's a particularly excellent character named Rhea of the Coos, who is a witch. I mean, the name Rhea, of course she's a witch. She is one of King's great grotesques, She's one of those King villains who doesn't really have any redeeming features whatsoever, is completely vile on almost every level, but is a lot of fun to be around because of it. There's an awful, awful purity to Rhea. She is just spite and cruelty and malignance for the sake of it. And through her, a lot of the major mythology is emphasized. You get to see a lot more through her of what's actually happening, of what's actually going on. It's a very visual, almost. There's almost like a painterly quality to the story that Roland, and by extension King, tells. You get to see so much of this world, and the town itself is so well realized, it's set out so well that you can walk with Roland through it and you can see how it's set out. You can see the main high street, the sort of little straggling farms on the outskirts, the mountains and hills where Rhea lives. It's really interesting. The whole thing is really interesting. And you also get to see a little bit more of the internal politics that ultimately destroyed Gilead, that turned it on itself in civil war, and ultimately destroyed it and all of the other gunslingers. It's a good. For my money, I really enjoy this one. I actually really enjoy this one. I think, for my money, it's actually one of the more coherent books in the series. It's one of the more solid books in the series, because the story that Roland tells lends it a certain structure. It has this very dark sort of fable or fairy tale structure. And it's good to know a little bit more about this man, because Roland, really, up until this point, has been kind of a stranger, even to the other members of the quartet, and certainly the reader. You don't, beyond his obsession with the tower, beyond the strange sort of mythological references that he keeps making, you don't really know much about the guy. There's not much background on Roland of Gilead at all, beyond what he allows you to see. He's kind of a mystery. This tells you who he is. This shows you who he is at heart, and kind of I think even Roland points this out himself, the boy who he was when this story was set. He has done a great deal to put away, to kind of do away with, to bury beneath this sort of calcified rubble of manhood, this creature that isn't even really a human being. It's just a vessel for Ka, for the agenda, for the imperative of wider fate, or the machinations of whatever power or god is driving him on to the tower, you know? And this is where that breaks. This is where you get to see Roland as a human being, maybe for the first time. Maybe for the first time. And you get to see the boy he was and all the mistakes that he's made. And it works very well. It works very well for my money. Like The Wastelands, it doesn't necessarily have an ending. It's a transitional book, so it's sort of like a passing through book. Despite its immense size, there is a sense of passing through this one. There is a sort of finale to it, because after the story has been told, there is this bizarre Wizard of Oz reference where they find along the way literally a recreation of the Emerald City. It is literally a recreation of the Emerald City that's just smack bag in the middle of nowhere of Topeka, Kansas. And they meet, of all people, they meet there Randall Flagg. They meet the Man in Black. They actually have an encounter with the Man in Black there. And it's a no-win situation. I mean, Roland tries to kill him and it doesn't work, because that's not what fate, it's not what Ka has ordained. And the Man in Black, again, takes incredible pleasure in baiting Roland, and basically pointing out that, look, you've been led a merry dance by fate, by everything around you to this point, and it's all been me. It's all been me. I am the divine hand of Ka, of fate, and I am shaping your destiny. And that's kind of fun. It's interesting to actually have a confrontation between these guys at long last. But it's demonstrated that really Roland doesn't have a chance. This guy, he can pretty much do what he wants. He's a miracle man. He's a miracle worker, as we've seen before. And Roland's guns are absolutely useless. Everything Roland can do is taken away in this encounter. He's reduced to powerlessness, to helplessness. And that's because that's what the Man in Black is like. That's who he is. It's a strange, very surreal moment, and it can be read as slightly jarring with the rest of the book, because it is so strange. It is so bizarre. But again, I like it. I think it's a nice sort of palate cleanser from what has gone before, because the story that Roland tells is almost traditionally structured, and this throws in that token, or rather that characteristic Dark Tower weirdness. I like the way that this story really captures the meta nature of the Dark Tower series. I mean, this is a story that is very aware of stories and of what stories are and of the way they work. It's aware of mythology, and the characters in it are aware of mythology and the fact that their status is mythological and what they're doing is mythological. So they are not operating in a rational way anymore because they're not operating in a rational status. They're actually operating in a mythological world, and they are slowly learning that those are the rules. Those are the rules now, that rationality and reason don't have as much place in their new state as they did before, and I really like that. I really like that. The way these stories increasingly from this moment start to become Ouroboros-like. They start to tie themselves in meta-narrative knots where the characters are aware of the fact that they are wandering through written stories and that they are as much products of mythology and imagination as they are actual beings, and what they're doing is as much about saving the world of the fantastical. It's as much about saving dreams and imagination as it is saving literal worlds. And I like that. I think that's a really cool thing that King himself as a writer becomes increasingly aware of as this series goes on. The meta element just starts to go off the rails after this. It really does. And it culminates arguably in Song of Susanna. There's a moment in that which, for many people, it makes or breaks the books. It makes or breaks them. You actually get to... There's a moment that is... It will either be fantastic for you or it will just destroy the entire series. And for a lot of people, it destroys the series. I will tell you that now. When we come back, we actually will do the Wind Through the Keyhole. So until then, my dears, bye-bye!